Have you here? My name is Richard Smith. I used to teach here, but they got me out of it. So I'm just a retired old man now. Anyway, I'm very pleased to introduce Andy Schonebaum from the University of Maryland. He was here last year. Did any of you hear him speak last year? A few people. Well, this is new stuff, so it's not a problem. But I was very sick when I hosted him last time. I can't remember anything about it. So I invited him back down. Oh, it really is. Anyway, Andy's a very good friend. One of the best scholars in Chinese literature you'll find anywhere at any rank. He has written a pioneering book called Novel Medicine that tracks the way Chinese learned about medicine by reading novels. And it is just a magnificent work, and he's gone through all kinds of wonderful literary sources. And I got to know him because he and I were working on similar kinds of topics. I'm in the middle of writing a book called Magic Matters. Science and Medicine in Chinese Popular Culture. And I'm still working on it, whereas Andy has finished his second book, which is going to be a blockbuster too, and will be out this December. Is that right? Yeah, calling Observing the Unseen. And if you saw the blurb for the talk today, you'll know basically what the theme is. But it's a really wonderful rumination on the things that we take for granted, on the things that we think are clear and are not, and a wonderful examination of the interplay between what you might call the real and the unreal. And those of you who know anything about Chinese novels know that many of them play with that kind of theme. And so what Andy has done, if I can be informal for the moment, is to look at these sources, kind of what are sometimes described as middle-brow sources, to find information about how Chinese understood the world about them. And I don't know if I'll ever finish my book, but when I do, every footnote will say something like, see Andy Schoenbaum's observing the unseen, page so-and-so. And so I owe him a wonderful, or a deep debt for his scholarship and his friendship. And not only that, but last night he saved my life. Because we were going through an intersection at Maine and somewhere, and the guy ran a red light. And Andy said, "Whoa!" I believe that's what he said.
I'm sure it was equally eloquent.
Got my attention. And so we're here to tell the tale. Let's see if there's anything else. The range of Andy's work is really extraordinary. And almost all of it has to do with either these kind of interesting themes about how popular literature informs a middle-brow reading culture, but he also is a specialist on two of the greatest Chinese novels on earth. One of them is called Hong, the Dream of the Red Chamber, also called The Story of the Stone, for the first 80 chapters of it, and the other one, T.P. May, is the plum in the
golden vase.
Yeah, the golden vase.
Lotus.
I guess that's the best translation. Yeah, it's his translation. It's the best translation. And so he has done books on these topics and written about how to teach them. So not only is he a wonderful scholar, but he's also a terrific teacher and a wonderful person generally. And without any further ado, Andy Schoenbaum.
Well, thank you, Professor Smith, for that hyperbolic introduction. I'm very happy to be here back at Rice. I really had a great time last year, where I was sort of shamelessly promoting this book that I was trying to finish, and gave a little talk trying to introduce some of its themes and methods. And I'm just going to do more of that today. Like, I'm going to talk about the same book, but a little more specific. So I wanted to...
bottom mouse.
Oh, bottom mouse. Okay. So if I click on this... There. Okay. So these are the two books that I have now written, monographs. And the newest one is called Observing the Unseen, Curiosity and Common Knowledge in early modern China, and by early modern I mean pretty much like 1600 to 1900, sort of like Shakespeare to James Joyce, but in China. And my thought was sort of to try and investigate how regular people, if there is such a thing in the world, investigated their world, understood like the natural world, and what were the sort of sources and methods they used. And I thought and it's largely texts, right, in the pre-modern period. Empiricism was just sort of nascent and becoming a thing that was sort of acceptable to do. But I was thinking it would be interesting to sort of see how people tried to investigate things that didn't really have a visual reality, or sort of that were sort of easily overlooked or sort of invisible. So this is you probably can't see the slide very well. But so yeah, I have chapters on fortune telling and divination, which Professor Smith has also written extensively about. I've a chapter on thunder and the sort of retribution it was thought to bring, and how it supposedly worked. I have a chapter on dragons and their bug-like nature. They were sort of classified as the kings of bugs, and so talk about that a bit. And then I have a chapter on secret medical practices, like slicing flesh to feed your ailing parents and stuff like that. And then one on animating forces and sort of the stuff of life, and a chapter on water. And I know you can see water. I know that it is not totally unseen, but I think it's interesting when it's sort of overlooked or looked at in particular ways, and then somebody sort of takes a new perspective on it. So I wanted to talk to you about that. I thought you might be interested in that chapter. And it's mostly, well, it's partially about water, but it's also partially about spit and rainbows. So that's where we're headed. I hope you'll find it somewhat interesting. So I thought I would start this talk with this image, which I think is pretty and has water in it. It says "Donglioshui," like eastern flowing water, right? Which is, on the one hand, a sort of geographical reality in China. Most of the rivers flow from west, in the Himalayan mountains, to the ocean in the east. And but Donglioshui, the east-flowing water, has become, especially since the big Tang poets like Li Bai and stuff employed that phrase in their poetry, it's become a metaphor for this sort of inexorable realities of fate and of where am I going? I gotta see this. Okay. The inexorable passage of time, the transience of human affairs, and the finality of fate. And I mean, so obvious, and I thought it would be good to start talking about rivers, because that is usually, or at least in my mind, frequently what people think of when they think of like China and water. Like Philip Ball wrote a book, the title of which I have forgotten already, but in it he calls China like a hydrologic society or something, because the rivers in China, obviously they flood their banks and have for thousands of years, killing many people, and the sort of grappling with that, tragedy and sorrow, and yet reaping benefits from it in subsequent growing seasons, because the land on the side of the riverbanks had become fertile because of that. So anyway, I wanted to sort of start with this physical reality of these rivers, and this sort of metaphorical belief that they are a symbol for sort of the futility of man in the face of time and water. And yet, also in this period, this sort of this late Ming and early Qing, or like 16th and 19th centuries, 1600 to 1900, 15th to 19th centuries, basically, we see the sort of empires expanding, right? And so we've got enfolding other cultures, other peoples, other lands. We see urban centers are growing, and a lot of those new products, new people are finding their way into urban centers. And so people are sort of grappling with evidence that challenges some sort of long-held and textually revered facts and beliefs. And at the same time, we also have sort of contact with the West and with Jesuits and Western learning and technology. So, like for instance, a lot of texts talk about water methods, and water methods can mean very many different things. And in one case, it means this Western Taisi water method is an Archimedes screw, which actually does make water flow in the opposite direction, right? And sort of challenges this inevitable Dongmyo-shui paradigm, right? And of course the Chinese called this Archimedes screw a dragon's tail because, it's commonly thought that dragons could control water and make it rain and were the cause of storms and droughts. And water methods also, another one of these exact, same title, Taixi's Shuifa, the Western water method, was a method to paint, a method to render water in paint that was, new and unique. And the water methods extended beyond, there were domestic water methods too, and in these medical manuscripts that are housed in the Berlin State Library, that were made by practicing doctors for their own use, and therefore are sort of records of reading, like a healer would learn from their parents or read texts and then copy information into these manuscripts for, just for themselves to use. So they clearly thought that was true and actionable information in there. But it's a really interesting source for us because we can see what has been copied and what has been miscopied and what has been left out. But in this case, the water methods copied in this manuscript are not really medical. They're sort of quackery, intentional sort of charlatanism. It's this manuscript records ways to write on water and ways to you make a paste and draw some words, some characters on a wall, and the paste dries and the characters become invisible. And then you communicate with the spirits in the marketplace, and ask some questions and write the characters on the surface of the water and throw the water on the wall, and the characters appear, and everyone is amazed and believes that whatever medicine you're peddling might have some real effect. But I don't really want to talk about these kinds of encounters with water. Today I want to talk about some sort of more personal relationships with water. Obviously it's made to brew tea and to bathe in and to make ink with. So I wanted to sort of explore what it meant that there were different kinds of water. And so this is a page from the Bensalgangmu, which is, so you can see 1592, very sort of tail end of the Ming Dynasty. And it's the most famous by far, I don't think I'm saying anything hyperbolic there, sort of pharmacopoeia or materia medica in the Chinese tradition. It's huge, and it's encyclopedic, but also it's really an encyclopedia of the literary tradition, because the compiler, Li Shizhen, drew on and commented on, even sometimes saying, don't read this text. But he drew on almost literally the entire literary tradition to include ghost stories and poetry and plays, all other medical texts and sort of other scientific type and naturalistic texts that had come before. But anyway, Li tells us that that there are 43 different kinds of water, and that he himself discovered and tasted 11 of these different kinds of water. And Thanks. And century later, or a century and a half later, well, actually, this book was so important, the Bentao, which I'm going to call the systematic compendium for the sake of brevity, became so influential that a number of supplements appeared that were written by other authors. People wanted to sort of add on to it. And sort of the most famous of these, which is called the supplement to the systematic compendium, was written around 760, about a century and a half later, and it includes many additional kinds of water. But it was only published even 100 years after that in like about 1860. And so people who were aware of the original text, the Bentao, and of its supplement, which came out 2.5 centuries afterwards, might have gotten the sense that there were lots of new waters being discovered sort of regularly. But the author of this supplement lists lots of different kinds of water, including clouds and plum and cherry water, and something called rising dragon water, and something called chicken spirit water. And he lists 20 types of dew and many others. And they all had their own specific medicinal qualities. And although Zhao, I already told you this, but yeah, so essentially, Zhao wasn't the only one to supplement the Bentao, and there were many other materia medica texts that added to this growing corpus of waters. And let's see here. This is a little challenging. Oh, yeah. Some people have argued for the commodification of water that supposedly happened in the late Qing, in the like 18th and 19th centuries, as a result of sort of growing urban centers and the feeling that they were particularly sort of dirty places, and that water that had been brought in from the mountains and far away, sort of more pure places, became commodified. But it's sort of obvious that this impulse predated the Qing by centuries. But anyway, it was also a site of contestation of like if there were many different kinds of waters and what kinds of waters there were. This is a famous novel called Journey to the West. It's about Monkey King, and he attends this monk on this long journey from Chang'an to India to fetch Buddhist sutras, and with the intention of bringing them back and translating them. And on their journey, they encounter all of these monsters and demons and other problems that they need to conquer or solve or resolve sort of intellectually or physically. And in this chapter, they go to this they arrive at the gates of this kingdom where the king is ill. And Monkey has the following conversation with one of the king's ministers. He says, according to the people of our region, the minister says, according to people of our region, the way to get sourceless water, which was a key ingredient for the medicine to cure the king. The way to get sourceless water is to take a container to a river or a well, fill it with water, and go straight back to the house without spilling a drop or looking back. And when you return to the house, that will be considered sourceless water with which the person who is sick may take the medicine. And the monkey replies, both well water and river water, said Sun Wukong, have sources, and that's not what I mean by sourceless water. So it was well known that dragons were a source of water, right? This is why dutiful officials for hundreds of years made sacrifices to Dragon King temples in times of drought, and fearful farmers prayed to dragons for rain. But it's also why Sun Wukong asks Aoguang, the Dragon King of the Eastern Ocean, for some of his saliva, which Monkey says is the real sourceless water. And while the satire of this passage from Journey to the West is largely about feeding a foreign king like dragon spit and horse urine, it also hints at some very real debates about the nature of water and its different kinds of properties. If we consider this passage from another novel, The Dream of the Red Chamber, or The Story of the Stone, you can see what I'm talking about. So is this made with last year's rainwater too, Dayu asked her. Adamantina looked scornful. Oh, you are so vulgar. Can you really not tell the difference? I'm quite disappointed in you. This is melted snow that I collected from the branches of winter-flowering plum trees 5 years ago when I was living at the coiled incense temple on Mount Shenmu. I managed to fill the whole of that demon green glazed water jar with it. For years I couldn't bring myself to start it, so I left it buried in the earth all these years, and then this summer I opened it for the first time. Today is only the second time I have ever used any. I am most surprised that you cannot tell the difference. When did stored rainwater have such buoyant lightness? Was water really an object of connoisseurship, as Adamantina suggests here? Were tea drinkers supposed to be able to tell the difference if they were refined enough between last year's rainwater and the melted snow collected off of winter-flowering plum trees 5 years ago? It seems like a joke, right? Meant to sort of highlight Adamantina's eccentricity, her guaipi, right? And her obsession with purity. But perhaps readers took her seriously. The market does seem to have distinguished between waters. A story in Liao Jiazhi mentions that in some places, the price of the mountain water was like that of jade liquor. It was of such high quality that there was no one willing to give it away. Mountain water's premier status in the classic of tea might also explain the cost. It says in it, mountain water is the best, river water is second, and well water is the worst. Because water could take on the properties of its environment. Its origin was crucial, right? If one had to use well water, it was important to use wells that were frequently drawn from. But it was also possible that water drawn from mountain valleys could contain hidden dragons or other poisons. So it was best not to draw from those locations during the summer months. Waters differed in ways that didn't correspond to modern assumptions about mineral content or contaminants or pH levels. Discussions of water and their origins and flavors greatly increased in number from the mid-16th century on, and so did the number of waters that were identified. The scholar and gastronomist Yuan Mei writes in his book, the Recipes from the Garden of Contentment, about the different flavors of pure water for the brewing of tea. And he says, if one wants to make good tea, one must first store good water. Specifically, one should insist on storing water from Zhongleng Spring or Hui Spring. And he tells stories of people who attempted to and failed to transport mountain water from these springs. He inadvertently unmasks pretentious connoisseurs when they couldn't tell that the Hui Spring water had been switched with another during the long journey. He emphasizes the importance of collecting and storing rainwater and snow water properly. Newly collected water has a harsh flavor, but aged water has a sweet flavor. Boil the water over an aggressive flame using a hollow-centered jar, Yuan counsels. Brew the tea immediately when the water boils, because if you boil the water for too long, the flavor will change. And the water itself, even from a spring or from melted snow, has flavors that ideally contribute to the overall experience of tea. But if not stored properly or if it boiled too long, the tea will be ruined. Zhang Dai describes the process of bringing water from hundreds of miles away without letting flavor-altering bubbles develop in it. And another author, Ji Yun, was curious why his friend, Liu Quanzhi's well water changed its taste every day at midday. And he explains this behavior by analogy to a place where the water has 12 tides a day in precise accordance with the sundial. So Adamantina from Story of the Stone may have been finicky in distinguishing between melted snow and rainwater, but she was detecting subtle flavors given to water by its origins, by its environment, and time, just as literati authors did in the real world. So the systematic compendias, different waters, they take the form of rain and snow and dew and frost and hail and ice, which have different characteristics depending on when and where they were collected. But sorry. But it was also essential to collect water at a particular time. And he talks about suspending water, which is water that gathers in the top section of bamboo, like fences. Like you would cut the tops of bamboo off at an angle, which would leave like a little sort of cup-like shape. And the rainwater that collected in the bamboo posts of fences was called suspending water. Plum rain occurs in the heat of summer as an incessant drizzle that makes people sick and makes things become moldy. Divine water is collected from inside bamboo if it rains between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. on the 5th day of the 5th month. And bright water is extremely pure and suitable for religious ceremonies. Water from a leaking roof is good for eliminating warts, but will poison any food that it drips on. And a story from Liao Jiazhi backs this up. So running water has the tendency to bring things downward and is therefore good for preparing drugs that treat diseases in the lower part of the body. Water from a quickly flowing stream is best for stewing drugs to urgently remove or to urgently soothe stool and induce vomiting, to induce stool and urination. While adverse running water, because it is going backwards or upwards, is good for making drugs that can induce vomiting. So it is possible to change the nature of certain waters, like laboring water was, you take a basin of water from a well and you take a spoon and dip some out and pour it back in from a height, and you do that 1,000 times. And having been splashed so many times, it becomes light in quality and sweet in taste, and in this way benefits the spleen and stomach rather than the kidney. So water connoisseurship celebrated bringing the mountains to the city, which was an ideal reminiscent of Tao Qian's A Hut in the Realm of Men. But it was also about the power and privilege to do so, right? Elevating water to commodity status was also about refinement, learning to see or taste what could not be seen in an effort to reestablish distinctions between literati and their social inferiors, pretenders, or charlatans. It was also a fact that there were, in early modern China, many different waters with different effects on the body, and some were rarer than others. Can I make this wider? Oh yeah, can I do this? This might be easier. Okay, this will be better. Maybe, can I do this too? Yeah, there we go, that's much better. Okay, so Li Shizhen identified waters from a particular place as taking on properties of the environment. And the Ming and Qing dynasties were rapidly expanding to encompass new regions and new ecosystems. Moderns may see this as akin to the 20 different brands of bottled water you see at the bodega, from Fiji or Switzerland or something. But Li saw them as coming as categorically different types of water. He tells the story of Dr. Ma Zhiji, who once visited an official who had a copper water clock that measured time by the dripping of water. And while he was there, the official called somebody to fix the water clock and explained that the water inside of the clock had already circulated through it 3 times, which had made it stretch out and made it slippery, and so that the water would no longer keep proper time and had to be changed out. And Li writes this down. He writes down this story, and he says, "After learning this, I began to realize that the waters under heaven are the same, only when they're used to put out fires or irrigate crops. Their quality may change in different locations and because of different uses. That is why in dyeing silk fabric, if water from Sichuan River is used, the color will be bright. In paper making, when water from the Jiyuan River is used in the processing paper, mulberry leaf paper, the product will be white and lustrous. In the area of Nanyang, ponds are close to chrysanthemum farms, and the local people live longer lives as they drink water which is close to chrysanthemums." So in this way, water was liquid space and liquid time. It needed to be gathered at certain times for maximal effectiveness, and it also needed to be from a certain place or to have flowed a certain distance. Mountain water was desirable to help treat illnesses, not just because mountain water was pure, but because it took on the properties of mountains. In a similar manner, water gathered from the hoof print of an ox, if you couldn't find that, you could substitute it for water gathered from the rut of a cartwheel in the road. And that's because they shared, it's not that they both had the same sort of contaminants or particles mixed into it, but because they both shared properties of roads, right? That ox and carts both helped to move, that's okay, I did, thanks. They both helped illnesses move out of the body, as like oxen and cart help move goods down the road. And this is why mid-sky river water, water gathered when flowing out of a bamboo gutter, was efficacious against madness, demonic infestation, malign chi, and noxious poisons. But water gathered from a leaky roof was highly poisonous, causing noxious diseases if imbibed. And presumably, the primary difference is that water that stays out of your house running down the gutters is obedient and useful, right? While that which leaks through the roof is obstinate and inappropriate for healing. All right, let's see here. Let's skip that. Okay, because it took on properties of time and place, water could counteract bodies that were adversely affected by timing or place. And this goes beyond metonymic logic. Water was the conduit of local properties. Liushizhen enumerates 43 kinds of water, but there are really many more. And if you consider his discussion of water endowed with seasonal chi, he begins by reminding readers that 1 year is comprised of 24 seasonal periods, each of which lasts half of a month. So the chi and flavors of water change in accordance with the seasonal chi. And Lee encourages readers to fill a bottle with water on each of the first 12 days of the first month. Each day stands for a different month in the year, and each bottle will have a different weight. The heavy ones indicating more rain in that month, and the lighter ones less. And Lee points out that even among the days, the chi of water is not identical. How much more this applies to the chi of water from month to month. So because water took on properties of its place and time, it could cure human bodies that were, that were already affected by space or time, like unseasonable events in nature, statutory illnesses, miasmas, and so on, showing just how much space and time affected human bodies. And it didn't just cure mundane illnesses, right? Accounts of medical texts and anomalies invoke water as one kind or another as a weapon to battle demons, or as a conduit between seen and unseen realms. Water's metaphorical purity and its ability to cleanse and combat dirt also made it a weapon against unseen malicious forces. Death was a contaminant, it was a pollutant, and ghosts were thought to be dirty and smelly. A number of texts comment that ghosts do not see dirt, just as fish do not see water. And as such, sorcery and demonic magic and black arts are practices that cross the boundary between life and death, the legitimate and the illegal, the needed and the dangerous. And water is a part of these practices, being both tangible and insubstantial, seen and unseen. So apotropaic measures were often attempts to thwart being soiled by the impurity of death or contaminated by ghosts and demons. Yuan Mei's, who we met talking about tea, has anomaly accounts that describe methods to combat ghosts that involve ingesting water, spitting it, writing on it, or throwing it. In one instance, a monk writes some spells and chants, incantations, in addition to tossing a cup of the magical water in the direction of the ghost's head. And that practice is also recorded in these medical manuscripts. Water is also a key to combating bugs and other pollutants in the body, in turn, a key to achieving Taoist enlightenment. In one account, a Taoist adept teaches a scholar the method of drinking water. By eating too much, our bodies become heavy and littered with filthy bugs that grow in the stomach, he says. A person who wants to learn the Tao must first cleanse his mouth and purify his intestines. Without food, all of the bugs inside the stomach will starve to death and be flushed out of the body. Water is the first essential life force. At the birth of the universe, water was the first of 5 elements to appear. So drinking water is the secret to becoming immortal. However, the water from the towns and cities is dirty and polluted. Drinking such water will harm your spirit. So one must obtain the purest water from the mountains and swallow it slowly so that a gurgling sound is produced in your throat. So ghosts smell bad, and each ghost has its own odor, according to Yuan Mei, and a ghost has a strong, fishy smell. It makes perfect sense then that ghosts would fear the chi of water, a phrase that recurs in medical manuscripts used by healers in the early 20th century. One manuscript, for instance, discusses the exorcistic practice, the method to spill water, in which one utters specific words and says the names of large numbers of spirits and dragons. After that, one sprinkles water with one's hands and shouts, "Spirit water is spilled," which will then drive out the demons. Okay, so there's more connections with water and demons, and one of the things I want to talk about is saliva, and we just have to realize that saliva is just water made by people. This is the essential intervention, right? So Li Shizhen, again, the author of this Materia Medica, he writes, "Saliva fluid is a transformation product of human essence. Every morning, one should use it to rinse the mouth and rub the teeth. If one rinses the eyes with this fluid and regularly licks the thumbnail with his tongue and then rubs the eyes, after a long, long time, this will brighten his eyes and prevent them from clouding. Also, they are able to push away shades. So whenever one has a cloud shade in his eye, presumably like cataracts, all that is needed is to have someone else lick them with his tongue several times, and after a long time, the true chi will steam the shade and the poison will dissipate and the shade will retreat as a result." And then Li also quotes the Fandongyang Fang, saying, "Whenever someone dies from a nightmare and cannot be called out to, all that is needed is to painfully bite him on his heels and at the border of his fingernails, and to spit a lot of saliva on his face and gently call him, and he will awaken on his own." So, again, Li loves to quote as truth from all manner of texts. And he writes, "A note from the daily extractions of Huang Zhen says, during the Jin dynasty, Song Dingbo of Nanyang met a demon at night, and he questioned it, and it replied saying, 'I am a newly dead ghost.' And he asked what it abhorred, and it said, 'I only do not like being spat upon.' So Song Dingbo quickly grabbed it, and it transformed into a sheep. Fearing that it would transform again, he therefore spat on it profusely and sold it for 1,000 cash. Hence, one knows that demons do in fact fear human saliva." Okay, so again, this is a fact. This is in like the most well-respected medical text ever produced. I don't think I'm being hyperbolic in China, right? So this is true, but Li is sort of misquoting or misremembering this story, which originally appeared over 1,000 years earlier in this book called Investigations into Deities. And actually what happens is Song Dingbo encounters this ghost, carries it on his back, and eventually spits on it in order to turn it into a sheep, which he then sells. And then 200 years later, another one of our authors, Ji Yun, tells about a guy that he knows personally, whose son read this passage in the Ben Cao Gang in the Systematic Compendium, and and took to sleeping in graveyards with like a stick and a rope in the hopes of catching ghosts and spitting on them to turn them into sheep and then selling them in the market. But of course, like the kid never caught any ghosts, and like wrote about this as like what an idiot this kid is. But it just goes to show that like this information that's being transmitted in every sort of genre of text could easily have been believed, right, and put into practice. All right, so, did I show you that? There we go. Okay, so more amulets, more water. I'm gonna skip that one. Okay, so spit was also a really important part of Taoist cultivation. Like while meditating, there were lots of instructions about how one should swallow saliva. Virtually every Taoist health regimen included instructions to, quote, accumulate the fluid in the mouth and swallow it in a prescribed manner. This practice was rooted in the idea that saliva is an extension of jing, or essence, or semen. And adepts believed that through breathing exercises and concentration, the sexual essence in the lower abdomen could be transmuted into qi and then rise upward in the body and trigger a rainfall of sweet saliva in the mouth, which then could be ingested to replenish the essence in the lower dantian. And the body, in this regard, was its own sort of microclimate with its own water cycle. All right, this is a terrible, I don't have a segue for this, but we're going to talk about rainbows now. In my book, it's much smoother, I promise. But like water, and, well, rainbows obviously are made of water, we know. But like water, rainbows were visible yet transparent and mysterious. And like water, bugs, thunder, and prophecy, rainbows in China were tied to time. And the Book of Rites, which is one of the oldest classics, simply says that rainbows begin to be seen in the last month of spring, and in the first month of winter, they are seen no more. But this is not a description of like meteorological phenomena. This is a record of animal behavior. Rainbows were animals, and they were classed in natural science and natural history and materia medica. Rainbows were classed as dragons, as a subspecies of dragon. And dragons, as we know, were like in the bug section. Rainbows were animals, and like other bug-like creatures, rainbows hibernated in the winter. The earliest depictions of rainbows conflated them with a two-headed creature, a kind of dragon that came down from the sky and drank from rivers. Royal divination inscribed on a Shang dynasty ox scapula, a dragon bone, from somewhere between the 16th and 11th century BCE, reads, "There were great clouds from the east. In the afternoon, a rainbow came out of the north and drank from the yellow river." And another ominous divination reads, "The king prognosticated, saying, 'There shall be misfortune.' And on the 8th day, clouds in the form of a face covered the sun, and a rainbow appeared and drank from the yellow river." So dragons were long classed with aquatic animals, or animals that had scales, and those in turn were classed with bugs and snakes. And that rainbows were animals that came down from the sky to drink from rivers with their two heads is reflected in the Chinese character for rainbow. On the left side is, probably all know this, the left side of the character that comes first is the portion of the character, the radical, that suggests creature, but specifically bug or insect or worm. And then there's a sort of phonetic component on the right side, hong or gong, that gives it a sort of phonetic indication. But the early geography, the classic of mountains and seas, the Shanhaijing, writes that rainbows are located north of the land of gentlemen, and each one has two heads. And an illustrator, Guopu, the commentator, explains that, and borrows from a dictionary at the time, that Hong rainbows are didong. And didong, which is an archaic word for rainbow, but becomes affiliated with a kind of bug, like a scarab type thing. Anyway, some of the earliest texts also discuss other kinds of rainbows, like di and ni, and usually one was thought to be, when you see a double rainbow, one was thought to be male, a di, and the other was thought to be female, a ni, which were classed lexicography as being in the bug family, and medically, phenomenologically, as snake-like, dragon-like creatures. But there was still debate about the animal nature of rainbows right up until the modern period. Although there were several discussions that focused on rainbows being made of a combination of sun and water in the Tang and Song period, just as often they implied or explicitly discussed rainbows as living things. Like Shanghua discusses the nature of rainbows in an inquiry into common knowledge. He writes that it's generally known that rainbows dive into and drink from rivers, which he finds believable. And he then recounts his own inquiry. On a diplomatic mission, Shen writes, one day, as he was traveling to this diplomatic mission with his entourage, one day after the rain stopped and the sky cleared, a rainbow descended into the mountain stream in front of his hut, or in front of his tent. And Shen and his fellow emissaries went to examine it closely. And he saw that both of its heads were submerged in the stream. And he sent colleagues to the other side of the stream to repeat the observation. And so he was looking east and was able to see the rainbow, but those on the other side of the bank who were looking west into the setting sun couldn't see anything. And so, but after a long while, the rainbow moved east and disappeared. The next day, after walking a while, they saw the rainbow again. And Shen takes the movement of the rainbow descending, moving, and reappearing, and its two heads as evidence that the rainbow is indeed alive, although transparent. And at the end of the account, Shen quotes another scholar saying, "The rainbow is the shadow of the sun in the rain. When the sun shines on the rain, it appears." The rainbow animal was a being created by the interaction of sun and rain in a generative process akin to previous writers' description of heaven giving birth to rainbows. Some remarks suggest that tolerance of multivalent phenomenological reality of rainbows and other such things was waning, sort of by the end of the Ming or in the early Qing. And like Yi, for instance, who was a scholar influenced by Western learning, he asked, "Are rainbows really a kind of creature, Chong? If so, how could such a huge creature appear or disappear suddenly? Supposing that it is only a natural phenomenon, why can it suck water or drink?" But this comment is an aside, indicating suspicion, but not going so far as to rebuke Zhu Xi, the preeminent Neo-Confucian master of the Southern Song, and the long tradition of accepting, as he did, that some creatures can be physical and intangible simultaneously. The other Ming scholars were similarly ambivalent about the nature of rainbows. Few were willing to repudiate the millennia-old notion that rainbows were worm or dragon-like creatures that drank from rivers and streams, despite the evidence of their own eyes. Like Xie Zhaozhe, for instance, discussed the history of rainbows in major texts and concluded that although they have form, they do not have substance, yet they eat and drink. So this is quite curious, 可气. Today, in mountain valleys, rainbows drink from creeks and streams. People often encounter them. And they also drink from ponds. They are both male and female rainbows, and they can eat and drink, which is why the ancient form of the characters all used chong to indicate that they were animals. So the animal nature of rainbows seemed obvious based on their behavior, right, on their recorded behavior. And the anecdotes collected in Taiping Guangji, in this early encyclopedia, typify those found in Florilegia before and after it, depicting Hong, though especially Ni, and white Hong is often entering bedrooms, living in temples and crashing banquets. Like dragons, rainbows were also omens, and like dragons, the meaning of these omens was a topic of debate. Most often they were considered baleful omens, even perverse or licentious omens. Fang Yizhi mentions that in ancient times, rainbows were thought to indicate licentious qi. Taoist adepts by the Eastern Sea dug into the ground at the location of a rainbow and found red worms that could be used as aphrodisiacs, also based on this principle. So their licentiousness must have reminded readers that rainbows were, or were like, dragons, also thought to be the most lascivious of all creatures. Taoist ritual manuals include talismans to ward off rainbows, presumably guarding against the bad luck that they were believed to augur, rather than the destructive power of the animal that it was thought to have. There's more clarity about the meaning of white rainbows. I actually might skip this part. So it was also believed that white rainbows rose out of the ground and rose up to pierce the sun. And it's a phrase that occurs from Qin and Han texts all the way through Qing dynasty texts. White rainbows inevitably appear as evil omens in retellings of assassins, like the Jingke and Niezheng in particular. And it's not really clear what white rainbows might refer to or correlate to in modern meteorology, whether it's like an aurora or a solar halo or a fog bow or some other phenomena. But that they were evil omens was rarely in doubt. And this just goes to show the sort of actions of humans, like the intent to assassinate a king, disturbs cosmic forces and influences sort of natural phenomena. Let's see, I'll skip through this. This went much faster when I practiced it. But in the last days of the 18th century, Ji Yun, one of the authors I was talking about earlier, was still struggling to grasp the nature of rainbows and what they meant for the shape of the sky. He writes, "It's common knowledge that when a rainbow appears, it will stop raining. But the opposite is true. It is when it stops raining that a rainbow appears. When the clouds break and the sun shines, the light reflects and refracts on the other side of the clouds. The shape of the sky is perfectly round, and on top it is covered like a person's head wearing a bamboo rain hat. The rainbow's form droops down according to the shape of the sky. The ends curve like a bow, and rainbows are layer upon layer of clouds and chi, appearing to have clear borders and limits. They are piles, layer upon layer, of green and red color, and not physical objects like a belt extending halfway across the sky. As for coming down to streams to drink water or having heads that look like those of donkeys, those things are actually demon chi that looks similar to a rainbow, or some other demon thing that can change its shape into a rainbow." So Ji Yun, who was arguably the most well-educated person in the entire empire in 1800, he disambiguates between rainbows and their animalistic doppelgangers, making clear that rainbows are meteorological phenomena. But his world had not entirely shed its magical aspects. It was still one in which demons could take the shape of rainbows, and one in which textual authority was not easily contradicted. The sky held the sun and the moon, stars and clouds, all contained within an upper limit, and rainbows, like dragons and rain, were a key to understanding their relationships and resonances. All right, so let me wrap up here. So definitions and perceptions of water were malleable. Water was transformation, all things and nothing. But it also materialized intangibles like space and time. Water methods repelled demons. They moved water uphill, cured illness, and liquefied stone. Water connected the world of demons and the world of technology, the magical and the mundane. It was everywhere, but also precious, an object of connoisseurship, something to be cherished. And water was also an illusion, and water methods were widespread tricks to deceive and delude ordinary people. The proliferation of printed texts, along with intersecting with an already flourishing manuscript culture, increasingly presented water to curious readers as a site of contestation. The primary questions were not about what water was, but how to obtain, store, and use it. Different waters, either different within a tradition like medicine or across traditions, reflect particular kinds of inquiries. Water's properties divulged its origins, where and when it came from, and those properties defined its uses. How water was used said much about the user, and in that way, classifying water said more about those classifying it than it did about water's material reality. And similarly, inquiries into water show ways in which different modes of inquiry intersected, whether cultural, medical, demonological, divinatory, artistic, technological, or hydrological. Water reflected more about the early modern world, its people and practices, than it ultimately revealed about itself. Thank you.
Should be able to pull up the Q&A now.
Oh yeah, thanks.
All right.
All right, anybody want some water? Anybody have any questions or want to talk?
Let me ask.
Yes, Professor Smith.
Yes, sir. Another book that has a great pun title like yours is Dry Spells by Jeffrey Rankin. And it's a book about the rituals that were undertaken by the Chinese state and by localities to counteract a drought. And it's a brilliant book, I'm sure you agree.
Yeah, he has a whole chapter on dragons.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about these rituals of drought. I'm thinking particularly of water and how, if I remember correctly, there's a ritual in which dead women, were blamed for drought, and their bodies took water from the skies. Do you remember this?
No, I remember the naked women one, but
Yeah, well,
I mean, maybe I'm confessing a little too much.
Well, all I remember about it in particular was that, first of all, it was misogynist, and second of all, it had very much to do with bodies that were excavated in front of the families often, and the bones were then crushed. And that was supposed to somehow ameliorate the conditions of drought. And I wondered how this might fit into your general discussion of water.
Well, one of the big pieces that's missing from this talk is I have a whole chapter on dragons and the thought that they, again, were actual animals, but that they were also sort of magical. And there was a big debate about whether they could die and whether they could reproduce. You could go to the marketplace and buy dragon bones that were used in medicine. And the question is well, if these are real dragon bones, where did they, does that mean dragons die, or do they just sort of, is it like the skin of a snake that just gets shed? Do they just shed bones? In the Dry Spells book, the chapter that I really remember, of course, is all about sort of trying to attract dragons, bring dragons over so that rain will happen. And it wasn't clear if dragons could consciously create rain or if it just sort of followed them. But they were believed to be really licentious animals, and there are all these stories about cows being impregnated by dragons and even humans being impregnated by dragons. And so one of the real actual practices was to use attractive young women as bait, basically, to tie them to a stick in hopes of luring the dragon in. But yeah, I think, but for me, the other practice in that book that stands out is that all animals have proclivities, right? And they have things that they just like ghosts don't like spit. Dragons don't like iron. And so one of the other practices was to make little iron sculptures of dragons and throw them into caves and wells and places where they thought dragons sort of hibernated or hit out in the hopes of creating rain. But then also officials would expose themselves too, which sort of suggested that it was like that it was retributory.
That maybe looms over all of this is the question of efficacy. And, these practices were undertaken, sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't work, and there were various explanations for why they worked or didn't work. And I wonder if you could say maybe a little bit more about that, because the modern Western skeptical scientific mind is going to ask this question, did this stuff work? And your work does a wonderful job of dealing with that, and I wonder if you could say a little more about that.
Thanks, yeah. So you said it really well, right? That it's very hard for us to sort of divest of our own sort of biomedical and physical science understanding of the world. We're brought up with it from day one, and we understand simple properties of physics and metaphysics. There are no ghosts, and there's no monster under your bed and stuff like that. And so yeah, I think we naturally we want to know, like, okay, when people saw a dragon flying in the clouds, like, what was it really? And the answer is, like, it was a dragon. Like, that's what they saw. But yeah, I mean, I think also this, I was talking about in class today, how just this sort of paradigm of transformation is so fundamental to think like Chinese thinking in the pre-modern period, rather than creation and destruction, right? Like, it's not generative and destructive. The entire process of the universe is just change. It's just one thing turns into another. And because of that, I think there was sort of less suspicion. There was an ability to hold two opposing thoughts in the head at the same time, right? Because of transformation. These look like opposites, but they are fundamentally the same. And I mean, even Xunzi, like early Chinese philosopher, like 3rd century, 4th century BC, he says, like, sometimes you pray for rain and it rains, and sometimes you pray for rain and it doesn't rain. Why is that? And he says, it's not for any reason. He's like, the reason you pray for rain is because it's right. It's virtuous, it's what you do. It's what we do as officials. And like, we don't, heaven, as opposed to like the discussion about white rainbows that rise in response to murderous intent. Xunzi was like, well, like, the cosmos doesn't respond to human action. Like, we don't know why it does this stuff, but we know what we're supposed to do. And so I think, like, so for me, it's also kind of a mind-blowing thought. It's like, well, if it doesn't rain every time you pray for rain, then why are you praying for rain? But that's this sort of pre-modern mentality that, like, it is unknowable, but we know what we're supposed to do. So that's sort of how I view most of this sort of this kind of incredible ability to hold opposing views simultaneously and not, like a rainbow is an animal that's transparent. It has a physical reality and it doesn't. And so to me, this is incredible. And of course, Zhu Xi said it, and he's like the 3rd most important philosopher in Chinese history. So, no one's going to contradict him. So, but the fact that he can envision a world where something is seen and unseen at the same time is sort of foundational.
Other questions, please?
Hi.
Were there rituals and practices associated with like typhoons or like natural disasters associated with water?
Yes. So, that's a great question. So I've found lots of like individual bits of evidence. There's a story in Yuan Mei's account of when he was young. It's a first-person account. He was like, I went on this diplomatic mission to like the Ryukyu Islands, and so they're on a boat, and the storm came, and he's like, there were 3 dragons like that were swarming around the boat. And he's like, I saw them with my own eyes, but we were carrying like a message from the emperor on the boat, and so it was and dragons are associated with the emperor because of their like power and sort of mysticalness, and so he said someone on the boat said like, go get the scroll, the emperor's handwriting, show it to the dragons. And they did, and then the dragons flew away and the storm cleared. So I'm sure there were definitely other rituals to repel rain, you know, to like try to get the dragons to not hang out around here. But I'm blanking on them at the moment. Yeah. Jim.
Thank you so much for your talk. Really wonderful examples. So I was most interested in your discussion of connoisseurship of water. And I was wondering, so like connoisseurship that you talk about is like, what are great waters, right? And I was wondering if you see any signs of like more vernacular versions of that, like such as like, what are okay waters? Like for example, like, are there any signs that like restaurants and tea houses are supposed to be working with certain types of water, or if you're traveling to a place, definitely bring your own water because that's not okay water.
Great question. So there are a number of recipes to make pills that will prevent you from becoming thirsty, like on long journeys. And one of them uses like betel nut, which I can't imagine. But I haven't read like instructions for tea houses or critiques of tea houses that use bad water or something. That would be really, I'm sure they're out there. Once I get this great unread project up and running, I'll figure it out. But yeah, I think, you know, one of the arguments that I sort of hint at in my talk is what is, in my mind, a literati impulse to uncollapse the sort of social and cultural hierarchies that happened in urban centers when like merchants became rich and, you know, they were uneducated, but they were more powerful in some ways than the literati were. And so like taking control of water connoisseurship was sort of a cheap, easy way to reestablish your sort of cultural authority, I think. So that might be why there aren't like more sort of middle brow or like B+ waters, you know, like 'cause we don't want to talk about B+ water. We want to talk about literati water. Like, that's my guess. That's my guess. But there's gotta be stuff in novels about like, discussions of guys at tea houses being mad about quality of water. I'll go looking for it. It's a good question. Hi.
I have a kind of related question to Jamie's question on this good water and bad water. So the Yuanmei's and Li's differentiation between different waters kind of remind me of the emergence of 道地药材. So meaning like the local, like what is the best drug, what is the best material medica, it's coming from a certain place, right?
Right.
It's also
Korean ginseng, it's the best.
yeah, during the 18th century. And I guess my first part of the question is there any connections between these two kinds of practices? Would you just say water is one kind of the material medica that being differentiated based on this Dao-Di criteria? And the second part question, you kind of touch on that in your answer to Jamie's question is who holds the authority in defining what is good and what is bad? So for the material medica, for the Dao-Di Yaocai, it's apparently the merchants, the drug dealers, or drug sellers, because they are the ones who are benefited from
Whatever they have is the best version of that thing.
Exactly. So I was wondering, like, were the literatis the only person who hold the authority to choose the connoisseurship of water, or there are other group of people?
It's a good question. Like, were there water merchants, right? The sources I'm reading, you know, again, they're vernacular in that they are sort of written for a broad readership, but they're mostly written by elites, right? And all of this discussion about which water is the best, they talk about either fetching it themselves or paying somebody to fetch it for them. So it's not like they're going to the marketplace and buying from like the water stall. That's not, I haven't seen that. But Li Shizhen is a little more sort of practical, I think, when he's sort of like, well, you can take well water and make it really good by like pouring it out a bunch, or, you know, like putting chrysanthemums in it or something. But that's another really interesting question. But I always sort of was wondering about like it must be an honest thing to say Korean ginseng is the best ginseng, because like, no offense, but it's a tributary state, right? I mean, come on, like, I would think all good things come from China and nothing good comes from anywhere else. But when it comes to water, I definitely think it has to do with like taking back culture, right? Like this fantasy of a hut in the realm of men, you know, like, yes, we all live in a city, but I call my mansion a hut, you know, because I want that sort of like fantasy of an idyllic, hermetic lifestyle, but I'm not really willing to give up the like comforts of the city. So I think in some ways like taking water and making it into this, you know, desirable commodity was not just a way of sort of reestablishing authority over culture generally, but a way to kind of revive culture, like bring culture, traditions into the busy, dirty city. But yeah, I didn't read about any foreign water. I don't think I've read about any foreign water. I'll have to. It's too bad the book is being published. I really should have done this talk first. All right. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much, guys. I learned a lot from this talk. It's well outside my area. So I mostly work on Buddhism and mostly not in China. So this is a very different question, but it has two parts, if that's okay. In the kind of material that I read, especially thinking about like rainbows and optimal colored lights and things like that, there's very often a sense that that's associated with some kind of sacred presence or some kind of miraculous emanation or marking a certain kind of material or object, special or something like that, which I didn't notice discussed in your treatment of rainbows. And I'm wondering, I mean, you know, there are Buddhist texts like this in China. Are those just completely different realms of discussion, or does it happen to be that because of the kind of text that you're reading that have this more sort of medical, historical kind of approach, that they're just not engaging with those? So first part is there any connection, or are those just totally separate topics?
So I find Buddhist texts very hard to read. So let me just start there. Like Taoist texts, for some reason, way easier. So I read them. I read the things I can read. My feeling is that like everything I've seen about rainbows as like evil omens, they're either in histories, like official histories, or Taoist texts. And I'm not really sure why. I mean, I love those. I love the rainbow repelling talismans, right? Like, because, you know, like coming from Abrahamic traditions or Buddhist traditions, like, rainbows are so nice. Like, God's not going to kill us anymore, you know? It's awesome. You're so pretty. So I just love the idea that, like, they were like, get away, rainbow, like, evil, bad, horrible rainbow thing. But also, to me, like, for some reason I thought it was profound. I don't think anyone else thinks it's profound, but like the depth of the pre-modern sky was really shallow. You know, I mean, like the sun was not, you know, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of miles away. It was like right up there with the clouds, you know, and same with the stars. And like it was, if you could just send a balloon. So when like dragons, you know, they come out of the ground and pierce the sun. I mean, they're not flying for days and days. They just go up there. And so, so to me, these texts that are talking about that sort of imply the shallowness of the pre-modern sky also do not discuss, and you know, rainbows are animals, so like they can't fly all day, they'll get tired. So to me, it's not that like rainbows aren't a heaven sent thing. Like just because of like distance. I mean, I'm not sure if other people like agree with that or find that interesting to me, but the fact that like the sun is as far away as a cloud was sort of like clear when you read these texts. That's where the sun is. Might be layers, you know. The sun might be a little bit farther away, but it was definitely like in our atmosphere. I know that doesn't answer your question, but I can't answer your question, so I'm going to answer that question.
Part two is actually sort of building on this example of this sort of empirical study of, oh, there's this rainbow, let's go check it out from the other side and see. So I guess I can understand in one sense why, if empirical study was not a habit, that it didn't become an obvious thing to do this kind of study. But was there a discussion of, rainbows that appear every day in the same place and look exactly the same? Like that is a kind of obvious phenomenon that differs from the way that
Well, there's so there's sort of a precedent set in like one of the most famous like Chinese philosophers like What's right? And he's like, the way you know something is true is if the classics talk about it, if people have seen it, and if it is useful. And so, in that way, yes, classics talk about it. People see them all the time, and like everybody sees rainbows. I mean, I haven't encountered any indication that like there are places like if you go to this place, you will see a rainbow all the time, and you can really get a good one. But people say, oh, everybody's seen rainbows. We all know that they're translucent animals, And I think it was just like the sort of hegemony of textual authority, this sort of like oppressive weight of like, if Aristotle said that there aren't any atoms, then why are we looking for atoms? So I think it was just that, it was like, well, they're both. They're animals and they come and go with the rain and see through them. So I think, to me, it's just that sort of profound ability to like hold those pieces in your head. But yeah, it also shows how empiricism was just like not that big of a deal. Alicia Jen is like, I've got 11 new waters and I've tasted them all. Like, and that's so I know, But that really started in the late Ming and Qing. And it was still, these guys are just pouring over texts trying to answer these questions that you could look out your window and answer.
Thank you, sir. I think we owe Professor Schonebaum a welcome, not a welcome, but a goodbye applause.